Okay, so this is my review for Child of Satan, Child of God. This is my 2026 review, right? I did initially do this 5 years ago. I was going to record this review when I recorded my Helter Skelter, the 1976 movie review, but I completely forgot to do this. So I wrote this out probably about maybe 2 weeks ago now, and I'm just finally recording this. But anyway, of course, in 2026, I reread and re recorded Child of Satan, Child of God, which of course is by Susan Atkins, or Susan Atkins and Bob Slosser, but anyway. I originally did this because I created a Bandcamp page in 2025 and just to do like upload some of the poems and stories that I had read. Initially, I had read and recorded Child of Satan, Child of God in 2021, but of course, those original files were lost on a hard drive that crashed later on that year. So basically, long story short, I I wanted to redo the book anyway. And this was pretty much the Bandcamp page and all that was just a not an excuse, but yet another reason to do that. You know what I mean? I'm not going to lie. I just want to say I did want to have some people join me on this book. There, the reason why it took a bit longer to finish was because I had hoped to have some people guest voice on it. But the hardest thing about people the hardest thing about getting people to join you on a project is scheduling. And so many people have told me yes to interviews and projects, but goddamn, everyone's busy. And I don't blame them either. I don't blame them. So anyway, I wanted to redo this and I did. And I ended up just doing it myself because I didn't want to wait forever on one person to record one sentence. And it's better anyway this way because, like I said before, the original files to 2021 are lost on a hard drive that I still have yet to try being professionally recovered. And on top of that, there were chapters in the 2021 version that were partially corrupted because of the program I used at the time, and that it doesn't anger me anymore, but it like bothered me at the time. I remember distinctly some of those, I think, last couple of chapters when I originally recorded the book. I went back to edit the audio and I was like, what the hell? Why is it messed up? Anyway, this is just the intro part. Here's the actual review, right? So in rereading this book, there were some definite things I thought about. I was like, okay, I need to talk about this because I didn't think I was going to re-review the book, but in the years since reading different pieces of Manson literature, including many of the court transcripts, I've learned a lot. And so actually reading court transcripts, various books, and even reading about Anton LaVey, I was like, I do need to go back and reread Susan's book and see how much of what she said adds up to what has been recorded and what other people said, right? So I found this very, very interesting. So one thing that's the first thing I wrote down I found most interesting, right, was that I came across the poetry, not all of it, but some of it that Patricia Krenwinkel had written, and of course, Leslie Van Houten's short story, I'm a Fibbin. So it wasn't until I read Leslie's story and, of course, posted that on my YouTube channel that somebody, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, but somebody pointed out that I'm a Fibbin was used as one of the fake names in Susan's book. And I was like, hold up. Wait, is that real? And going back, I was like, that's right. That's true. And when somebody pointed that out, that was actually one of the reasons another reason why I wanted to reread Susan's story, because it's in the years since reading the court transcripts and things like that, people's poetry and short stories, you start to realize Susan's book and even Tex Watson's has these, I don't want to say innuendos, but they have these little references that the normal person wouldn't catch, right? So unless you knew a lot about Manson family stuff, you wouldn't read between the lines. And I think that this is quite heinous when you think about it, because the average person probably wouldn't have ever found this out, right? So who are these references for? Was Susan giving references to other Manson family members in her so-called Christian book? Anyway, I'm deviating from my review, so let's go back to what I wrote. So, looking through the story again, I realized that there are a lot more concerning parts to Susan's version of events, or versions of events, than I initially realized, of course. One of the main points is just how Susan would tell the truth in many ways while still also obscuring it. This is something that I remember writing about in my first review of the book. She would be surprisingly truthful when it came to things that weren't about her. But when there would be parts to the story that talked about her own crimes, her own faults, is that in the camera? I can't even see. Her own crimes, her own faults, and mistakes, she'd either not talk about them at all, or she would minimize them to the point where it'd make her seem softer than reality. Basically, she was really, really trying to make herself look good. One of the biggest examples of this is in chapter 6, where she talks about her crime in Oregon. The book makes it seem like Susan was some sort of innocent, soft girl that got caught up with a couple of guys that went to jail a couple of times. This isn't the case. And I did point this out at the end of chapter 6, when I did it this year, 2026. Her book completely glosses over the fact that she told the police, "I should have killed you," when they arrested her in Oregon. The two men she was with were career criminals, not just a couple of guys that were maybe misunderstood. These were career criminals that she was with. What's so odd to me in this chapter is that, and really throughout the book, Susan has this odd emphasis on being loved by men. I just felt like chapter 6 was one of the biggest emphasis or biggest points to This chapter really emphasized it, though, in my opinion. Her priorities were completely out of whack, and she doesn't even seem to recognize this. The book is written in a way where the reader is supposed to feel bad for her, like as if we should seriously feel sorry for this convicted killer because she just wanted to be loved. Ugh. I can't believe that no one seemed to point out while writing the book, no one seemed to point this out at how ridiculous it was that Susan was seriously hoping to find true love while on death row. The book inadvertently admits various things, which I'm sure only made her parole hearings more complicated in the future. I'm actually surprised that she thought it was okay to admit how she expressed no remorse for the victims of the Tate LaBianca murders while on death row. In the last chapters of her book, she stated that she felt bad for ratting out the other members of the Manson family, yet never said anything about Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojtek Frykowski, Gary Hinman, or Stephen Parent. Susan showed more remorse for snitching on her co-defendants than even doing drugs when pregnant. What's interesting is that Susan doesn't mention in her book how she called Stephen Parent the thing in the car during her grand jury testimony. I suppose that would really make her seem like a cold-blooded killer, right? I often wondered if her co-author, or author, as she said in one parole hearing, Bob Slosser, I wonder if he knew all the details or he just believed whatever sanitized version of the story Susan told him. Was this person trying to make her look good and purposely excluding details? Or was he completely unaware of the truth too? I actually believe the latter. I truly believe that various people involved with the Tate LaBianca case, from Susan Atkins, Tex Watson, to even Vince Bugliosi himself, didn't think that the court transcripts would be available to read one day. I think that many of these people did not expect for these murders to be a part of public interest for decades to come, even after their deaths. It's disturbing to me that Susan could so easily disregard life, innocent life, while lauding the people who took the lives of others. Rereading this book, I'm surprised that her co-editor, co-writer, author, Bob Schlosser, didn't seem to think there was any problem in her admitting that she helped Catherine Scher and Mary Brunner attempt to escape from prison, technically twice. It's like they really thought that admitting that wouldn't bite her in the ass. Many people have wondered over the decades what the point of the book was, and I think that there were multiple goals with it. One was to try and paint Susan in a good light so that she could be possibly given parole. This seems to be a common thought that people have, and of course I agree. If you read this book while having read even some of the court transcripts, you'll know that Susan is leaving a lot of details out while sanitizing others. It's clear to me that she recanted any statements of hurting Sharon Tate, as admitting to the truth would have instantly denied any possibility of parole. Another point of this book, to me, it also seemed like a not-so-sneaky way for her to admit to things when, of course, you read between the lines, which I said earlier. If you know the truth, you'll see that she made nods toward the crimes like as if a point of pride. Susan seemed to really think that she was being clever, referencing the fake names that family members would use, while also using the name of an actual Manson family member for one of the Christians that visited her on death row. And that was something I noticed when I first read the book in 2021. That never has been explained. I have often wondered, even after, like I said, reading it the first time, why she used the name Stephanie Schramm. Now, in the book, Schramm, I believe, has 2 M's at the end, and the actual person just had 1. So this Christian woman visits Susan after Susan so easily or quickly becomes a Christian, right? But the beginning of the book says that real names have been changed to protect, people's identities. So what was the real idea here? Was she hoping to maybe get somebody hurt? Right? I don't know. I legitimately don't know why she would do that. So, for anyone that doesn't know, Stephanie Schramm was one of the last teenage girls that joined the Manson family before they all got caught. In fact, she was I hate using their lingo because it's really gross, but Stephanie was one of the young loves, one of the underage lovers of Charles Manson that I believe replaced Diane Lake. So, I don't know if this name was used to scare that girl who I believe by the time this book came out would have been a legal adult, but either way, it's still weird. It's odd. The beginning of the book claims that names were changed to protect the identities of people, like I said, but of course, actual names were used, and the Stephanie Schramm part also made me wonder if the names of the guards were changed or if the guards' real names were used, Like, this was like a cheap, crappy, barely legal, statement. It didn't do anything, right? Oh, we changed the names. Did you really? Because you still added real names in there. I wondered, was the guard that Susan had an affair with referred to by his real name? This is just my gut feeling, but I feel like he was, whether it was his first or his last name. Was it a fake name or was it half real? On top of that, I'm surprised, like seriously, that Susan would admit to breaking rules in prison while still in prison about having an affair with the prison guard. I mean, I really shouldn't have to say this, but it's obviously against the rules for prisoners and guards to have relationships with each other. So, of course, in the book, she just makes it seem like they were just attracted to each other. Oh, I have a crush on him, right? Okay. Supposedly they never had intercourse. But once again, if you read between the lines, it seems like this happened more than once. If this was a one-time thing, why would she even put it in her book? Once again, it seems like another not-so-secret way to gloat about her exploits while in prison. And on top of that, with how short the book is, you can't tell me that one day this prison guard just randomly decided to do this. I just believe a lot of things were left out. And of course, I wrote down, can we take the time to comment on how inappropriate that relationship is? Seriously. I don't think that Susan even realized how much an abuse of power that was. Unfortunately, it's not unheard of for prison guards to have affairs with inmates, both in male and female prisons. And there's a reason why such relationships are not allowed. Mainly, obviously, is because of pregnancy. It's concerning that she didn't seem to see how scary that could have gotten if things did not go that guard's way. He was in a position of power, and he could unlock the doors whenever he wanted. Did she not see, or just not care, that he could have taken advantage of her whenever he wanted? And virtually nothing would have happened to him, because Susan was already seen as a throwaway, incarcerated for life. I also wonder if this inappropriate relationship potentially stemmed because of something said earlier in the book, like a chapter before, where Catherine Scher pretty much implied to have sex with the guards to get, special treatment. Did Susan do this because Catherine told her to and was like, that's a good idea? Or was this something already going on to begin with? Catherine Scher mentions this, which seems to imply that in the past, Catherine Scher had inappropriate relations with prison guards. But of course, things like this that are mentioned, the prison guard thing, are just yet another example of how short-sighted Susan Atkins was and could be. It's clear that she obviously did not think ahead with many, many things. Another example of her short-sightedness is how she actually admitted to sending letters to Bruce Davis, another Manson family member, and falling in love with him. The book presents this scenario like as if she just wanted to be loved, and it's supposed to be sweet. But we have to remember, these people were convicted of murder and sentenced to die. Actual people really died. They lost their lives. And communication between the Manson family members was limited, as said in Susan's own book, to only talking about their cases only. In her book, Susan admits to using this rule as a ruse, as just a way to talk to Bruce. She was so desperate for love that she used the murders and deaths of others to potentially get a guy. Can you believe that? Do you think Gary Hinman would like that? Of course, it blew up in her face, as it should have. It was deserved, when Bruce's family prohibited him from contacting her further. When I read that part of the book, I also wondered if Susan even realized that Bruce Davis was potentially using her, which I think was very likely. I think he was likely using her to milk information out of her and basically have it to his advantage. Bruce was convicted along with her and a few others for the murder of Gary Hinman. And I just couldn't help but question, did Susan really think that Bruce Davis wanted a relationship with her? If so, she's even more short-sighted than I thought. To me, it seemed that Bruce used Susan to get any information about the crimes out of her, likely to use for his own future parole hearings, while also honestly proselytizing. Bruce Davis was known to have an interest in Scientology even before converting to Christianity in prison. I think that he truly believed in something. I do believe that he believed. But once in prison, I think that he likely used his religion to hopefully boost his chances of getting out. And of course, this never worked. While reading the book, I wondered if Bruce hoped that by helping his co-defendants convert, it could have been used to make him look good. You know what I mean? Not something done out of the kindness of his heart. I think that he used his religion partially as a way for the goodness of his parole and not the goodness of his soul, right? Much like Susan, too. I think much of the Christianity stuff in Susan's book was used to look good for parole and not for her soul. What's most interesting to me is that Susan nearly admits that she converted to Christianity as a way to hopefully get out of prison. I mean, she just basically says it in the book. This is discussed in the latter part of the book when Catherine Scher actually told her about the few ways that people get out of prison. Between doing her time, escaping, or finding religion, it seemed that finding religion would have been Susan's best bet. It sure is funny how after this conversation with Catherine, Susan just so happens to have her encounter with God in her prison cell. Well, God and Jesus, but you know. While we cannot actually prove that JC and God showed up himself in Susan's room, right? We can't prove it. I think it is valid to question the sincerity of her beliefs, considering her disregard for human life in the past. Right? I could question that, right? I'm going to. What's really strange to me is how there are so many people that are too afraid to question her religion because oftentimes they seem to be Christians themselves. I know from experience the reason why I even say this is because many of the comments I have gotten on my videos about this book seem to point this way. I've seen many people just be afraid to question the sincerity and validity of Susan's Christian beliefs. I guess it is seen as taboo to think that she was faking it. But I don't think it's bad to question her beliefs. In my completely honest opinion, I think that Susan Atkins did believe in something. I do think that. As evidenced, honestly, in her early childhood, though I don't believe all the certain things in those stories either, but I do believe that Susan believed in something. But because of the terrible upbringing and trauma she had in her early life, I don't think she saw or thought it was possible that any God would have cared about her. As many people seem to do, you know. I understand that mentality to a point. But even if she questioned whether God was real because of her own negative experiences, it just seems too convenient that she didn't go full throttle into Christianity until that conversation with Catherine Scher. It's ironic to me that she really struggled in prison, considering how she tried so hard to present herself as hard and tough in the past, even in the book. It was clear that none of the Manson women truly realized how brutal prison is, even a female prison, until, of course, they were sent there themselves and left to rot. One of these pieces of irony I found was from a 1977 article from the Sacramento Bee, where Susan Atkins is referred to as a frail little girl in horn-rimmed glasses. In this article, Susan is quoted as having said that she was at the bottom of the barrel when she met Manson. Strangely, at the time of the article, it stated that Susan wanted to be paroled so that she could live with a family in Tennessee. I'm unsure who this family was. It was not mentioned in the article, but I wonder if this had something to do with the New Life Foundation, which is mentioned at the end of the book, which I do think these people probably were connected with that foundation. The foundation had 2 addresses, one based in Tennessee. At the time of the article, the X that was carved into her forehead was apparently barely visible, though still there. What's also interesting is that in Susan's 1978 parole hearing, she mentions her book a little bit, actually, and it's almost kind of like an advertisement. Thankfully, though, Stephen Kay brings up her book and talks about how her business manager estimated that Susan would have made somewhere around $14 million for all of the various ways that she sold her story to the public. Stephen Kay brought up a great point that Wojtek Frykowski's son should receive any payouts from Susan's financial adventures, as, of course, she participated in Frykowski's death. On top of that, Stephen Kay was able to clarify as to why Susan hadn't been put in the general prison population at that point in time. So by 1978, Susan was still in PTU, which she talked about in her book. Which, strangely enough, just off the top of my head, Susan's book ends as of kind of making it seem like she got out of PTU. But when this book was published, she was still in it, the psychiatric treatment unit. The parole transcript from 1978 stated that Patricia Krenwinkel and Leslie Van Houten had already been put in the general prison population, though Susan hadn't. Stephen Kay, of course, was curious about this when he found it out, and upon some research that he did, he was able to find out that Susan was placed in the psychiatric treatment center for security reasons. He also found that in a 1977 psychiatric report, it stated that Susan's violence potential outside of a controlled and supervised environment is probably unpredictable. This, of course, seems to be quite different from how Susan presented this in her book, which had only, of course, came out a year before the parole hearing. In her book, she did say that part of the reason why she was likely placed in the psychiatric treatment unit was for the potential violence that could have been done against her by other inmates. And I do agree with that. I do think that it was very likely that Susan would have been attacked by other inmates if she was directly released into general population after leaving SSU. Whether the inmates believed her story or not, whether that she did or didn't kill Sharon Tate, would not stop the fact that violence against pregnant women is frowned upon, especially in prison, by other women. What is most telling to me, though, is how Susan didn't divulge in her book the statement from the psychiatrist who stated that her potential for violence was unpredictable. Yet again, we see how Susan Atkins lied by omission in order to make herself look better. What's interesting is that in this parole hearing, just a year after the book came out, Susan stated that she had nothing to do with the foundation, despite every penny from the book going to such foundation, as I believe was also stated in that parole hearing. So it's kind of like, once again, you see how very short-sighted Susan was. She devoted herself to Christianity. She felt like she could throw herself into this Christian foundation. And yet, barely a year after the book came out, she has nothing to do with the foundation itself. It's very short-lived. And obviously she didn't see a problem with this short-sightedness, how short-lived many of these things were, which is yet another reason why I believe she had problems with parole. She never had this long idea that Susan very obviously never had a long-term plan for much of anything, Anyway, so the 1978 transcript goes on to state that many didn't doubt Susan's sincerity in her religious beliefs. In fact, they believed she was truly religious, almost too much so. This was something that was also not mentioned in her book. In the book, it just came off like she believed. It came off like the guards, the staff, oh yeah, we think she believes in God. We know she believes in God, and that was it. But of course, what's left out is that people found her to be too fervent. Like, okay, she's like too zealous. She's too religious, almost a complete turnoff to people. The 1978 transcript goes on to reveal that she actually had gotten written up for being too fervent of a believer and trying to assert herself as some sort of religious authority in the prison. One write-up stated that she referred to some of the other inmates as her religious children, as she was supposed to take care of, because she believed she was supposed to have a ministry. Another write-up states that Susan had managed to talk to another inmate in the psychiatric unit, potentially convincing this other inmate not to take their medicine because the person believed that they were healed through religion. Susan went on to say that she never forced anyone to stop taking their medication. Of course, we can't truly prove this, but I found it interesting that she was written up for this. What's really interesting is how even her own lawyer, who was Richard Caballero at that time, stated that Susan was initially overzealous after finding Christianity. So, once again, it didn't seem that her belief in God was fake. It was actually obnoxiously the opposite. One last point about the transcript that I found interesting was how Susan admitted to having been engaged to a man at one point, but broke it off because he was a divorcee. She claimed that she didn't believe in second marriages. And this, of course, was hilarious to read because less than 10 years later, she would marry Donald Lee Lazier, a man that had been married multiple times before he married Susan. And then, of course, they divorced. And a few years after that, she remarried and had her second husband, James Whitehouse, who she stayed with until her death, I know that doesn't have anything to do with the book, but I found it in the fact interesting and, of course, hypocritical, right? In fact, if anything, it really does prove that Susan was very religious, overly so, but I think the best phrase for Susan was that she was hypocritically religious, and I think that's fair. Like many people are like, well, I don't know, she really believed, but, and that's fine. I think it's fine to question Susan Atkins because she was religious, but very hypocritically religious. So back to the book, though. In Susan's book, she claimed that she didn't kill Sharon Tate nor actually taste her blood. She claimed that she only said those things in Sybil Brand to Virginia Graham and Ronnie Howard as a way to make herself sound tough. What's strange is that she admits to stabbing Wojtek Frykowski in the legs in her book, though in her 1978 parole transcript, she seems to conveniently forget that she did this, acting like, I must have done it, I guess. I personally do not believe that Susan did not harm Sharon Tate. Or the better way to rephrase this is that I believe that Susan Atkins, without a shadow of a doubt, participated in the stabbing of Sharon Tate. This is a thought that Stephen Kay and Vincent Bugliosi, among others, also share. This seems to be confirmed by the autopsy report and court transcripts from the Tate LaBianca trial. In court transcripts, Vincent Bugliosi was able to question the coroner, Dr. Thomas Noguchi, about the autopsies he performed on the victims. In fact, before Noguchi went on the stand, Bugliosi had talked with the court, the judge, Judge Older, about allowing the autopsy photos to be shown to the jury. Judge Older barely allowed the autopsy photos to be shown, believe it or not. The autopsy photos were almost not even shown in this trial. Seriously. Judge Older basically said that they were too gruesome, to put it shortly, and he only allowed the black and white autopsy photos to be shown and not the color ones. To me, that should show you right there the brutality of these crimes. The first victim that they actually talk about was Sharon Tate. Dr. Noguchi stated that Sharon Tate was stabbed 16 times. She had rope burns on her face from how the killers tied her up with the rope, which was also put around Jay Sebring, Wojtek Frykowski, and Abigail Folger. In the court transcripts, Dr. Noguchi marked stab wound number 1 as below Sharon's left breast, with an irregular torn appearance. Stab wound number 2 was in the same area, left breast area, 4 inches in depth. This wound penetrated Sharon's heart, causing massive hemorrhage. Stab wound number 3 was also in the same area right below stab number 2. This also penetrated Sharon's heart, causing massive hemorrhage. Dr. Noguchi stated that these 3 stabs were done at an upward direction of about 40 degrees. He stated that Sharon would have been standing when this happened, and the direction of the stabs would have been left to right. To me, and of course I'm not a doctor, this is just my personal opinion, but to me, it does sound like the person that did this was left-handed and potentially shorter than Sharon Tate. It sounds like the person stabbed her in the heart 3 times. And for reference, Sharon Tate was about 5'5" or 5'6", and Susan Atkins was 5'3". Susan admits in her own book that she was left-handed. Now, what's interesting, and just kind of going off my review a little bit, what I wrote, is that actually in Tex Watson's book and even various pieces of literature, Tex Watson will claim that he was the one that killed Sharon Tate, and he does say in his book, Will You Die For Me, that he stabbed her in the chest. Now, whether you believe this or not is up to you, but when you look at the court transcripts and what Dr. Noguchi said, it almost seems like Dr. Noguchi seems to contradict Tex Watson. Did Tex Watson stab Sharon in the heart, or was it Susan Atkins? Even still, let's just pretend that Tex Watson did. Let's pretend that yes, Tex Watson did stab Sharon Tate in the heart, leading to those fatal wounds. There are still many more stab wounds that Sharon Tate sustained, which Tex Watson does not take accountability for, which brings up the question, who else stabbed Sharon Tate? In the court transcripts, Dr. Noguchi confirms that stab wounds 1, 2, and 3, the ones in Sharon's heart, were all fatal. So whoever stabbed Sharon in the heart did potentially kill her. Whoever did it did kill her. They tried to kill her. And did. So, going over the rest of the stab wounds for Sharon Tate, stab wound number 4 was also fatal, which came in the direction of left to right while Sharon was standing up. The stab wound penetrated into Sharon's chest cage about 3 inches. Stab wound number 5 was also fatal, in the upper portion of the right abdominal area. The stab wound was 1 inch in length and penetrated sideways from left to right, from front to back direction. The stab penetrated Sharon's liver at a distance of about 4 to 5 inches. Stab wound number 6 was located on Sharon's back. This was 1 inch in length and 2 inches deep into the muscle layer, but this was not considered fatal. Of course, this brings up the question, who stabbed Sharon in the back? Tex didn't own up to that. Stab wound number 7 was in the upper portion of the back, slightly to the right from the midline, so pretty much the spine. It measured 1 inch in length, and the wound went from the chest cavity on the left side, which pierced Sharon's lung. Stab wound number 8 was found in the mid portion to the back of the left side. It was 1 inch in length and went about 2.5 inches into the deeper tissues. Dr. Noguchi did not consider this one to be fatal. Stab wound number 9 was considered to be potentially fatal. It was found at the right side of the mid-back, measured 1 inch in length, and about 3 inches into the chest cavity, which pierced Sharon's right lung. Stab wound number 10 was found on the left side of the mid-back and measured 1 inch in length. The depth was 2 inches into the deeper tissue, though this was not considered fatal. Stab wound number 11 was found in the mid portion of the back, measuring 1 inch in length, and penetrated the left side of the chest cavity, piercing the left lung. This was considered a potentially fatal wound. Stab wound number 12 was found in the mid-back, slightly to the right, and the measurement was 1 inch in length, 2 inches into the deep tissue. This was not considered fatal. Stab wound number 13, or what was counted as number 5 on Sharon's back, was measured as 1 inch in length and went into the deep tissues about 2 inches, though Dr. Noguchi did not consider this one to be fatal. Stab wound number 14 was found on Sharon's right upper arm, penetrating from slightly back of the right forearm and causing what was literally called a through-and-through stab wound. I may be wrong, but if I understand this correctly, then that would mean that the person who stabbed Sharon here plunged their knife literally through her arm, though Dr. Noguchi did not consider this to be fatal. Stab wound number 15 was found on Sharon's upper arm and outside slightly from the shoulder. It was measured as 1.25 inches in length and penetrated about 1.5 inches in depth. This was not considered fatal. And stab wound number 16 was found on the back of Sharon's right lower thigh, and the direction was slightly upward. There were 2 more incised wounds on Sharon, which were considered superficial, which basically means that they didn't penetrate her skin like the others, but they sliced her. Dr. Noguchi counted 16 stab wounds and 2 incised wounds overall. What's very interesting is that if you go through Tex Watson's book, Will You Die For Me, he claims that he sliced Sharon on the face, or he cut her. But what's so strange is that this does not seem to be apparent in the court transcripts. In fact, what was on her face was the rope burn when Sharon tried to take the rope off of herself. In the court transcripts, Dr. Noguchi was asked if he examined Sharon's baby. He said he did, and he found that there wasn't any damage to the unborn child. The abdominal wound to Sharon thankfully did not hurt her son. It only damaged her liver. When he was asked by Vincent Bugliosi, how long after Sharon's death would you estimate the male fetus survived? Dr. Noguchi estimated that Sharon's baby could only live as much as circulation exists, no more than 15 or 20 minutes after maternal death occurred. This is the reality of how Sharon Tate and her son died. I bring this up because Susan's book glosses over this reality, and she tries not to claim any responsibility in any of these wounds. In fact, in her book, she acts like it was Tex that killed Sharon. And from the way it was described, she makes it seem like Tex Watson stabbed Sharon once and then she was dead. But obviously that's not true. There are 16 stab wounds on Sharon and 18 attempted total. In her book, Susan said of the murder, and I quote, "I turned to her. 'Shut up, you bitch. You're going to die.' Immediately, Tex was back in the room. 'Kill her,' he said. I grabbed her and held the knife to her, but that's as far as I could go. 'I can't, Tex.' 'Kill her,' he yelled. 'I can't.' He snarled. 'Get out of the way, then.' He plunged the knife into her. This is a gross minimization of the real-life events. Even if Tex's stab was the stab to kill Sharon Tate, who inflicted the 15, 17 others? Who inflicted the 2 attempted wounds that sliced Sharon? According to Dr. Noguchi, Sharon was mainly stabbed while standing up. Does that mean she was stabbed repeatedly while hung by her neck with the rope? Susan acts like she was just standing around doing nothing. But while Patricia Krenwinkel chased after and tackled Abigail Folger, and Tex Watson chased after Wojtek Frykowski, what did Susan Atkins really do with Sharon Tate? In her book, she states that Sharon fell on the couch at one point, right before her death. How many times was Sharon already stabbed by the time she fell on the couch? If she was ever on the couch at all. I think maybe it's potential that somebody was stabbed on the couch, though probably Wojtek, just considering the fact that Susan's knife was found in between the couch cushions. To me, it seems that Sharon Tate begged for the life of her baby while being stabbed repeatedly, standing up. The court transcripts and autopsy report seem to confirm this. In Tex Watson's book, he admits to slicing Sharon on the cheek, or that's what he says. His book is quoted, and I just wanted to point out, once again, this is fair use for me to quote this. Sadie was sitting next to Sharon on the couch as the pathetic blonde woman, Tex's words, the pathetic blonde woman sobbed, begging us to take her with us and let her have her baby before we killed her. It was the first time I'd realized she was pregnant, and for a moment it almost seemed like a good idea. But then Katie hissed, "Kill her," and Charlie's tape whirred, "Kill her," inside my head, and I looked at Sadie. But she just sat there, holding Sharon. So I reached out and made the first cut across her cheek. Later, Prosecutor Bugliosi, because of some things Susan Sadie bragged about in jail in one of her attempts to get attention, was convinced that it was she who killed Sharon Tate, but his suspicion was not true. It was my hand that struck out over and over until the cries of "Mother, Mother," stopped. So even if Tex Watson was the one that inflicted the wounds in Sharon's chest, this still does not explain the wounds in the back. Who inflicted the stab wounds in Sharon's back? His book doesn't explain that. Even further, Tex does not say anything about the slices to Sharon, nor the stab to her leg, or the stab that went through her arm. In fact, it really doesn't make sense that Tex could have inflicted all of those wounds while having also chased after Wojtek Frykowski and stabbing Abigail Folger. And on top of that, he went back at one point to stab Jay Sebring. Court transcripts from the Tate LaBianca trial show that Susan admitted to stabbing Sharon, as Stephen Kay pointed out in Susan's 1978 parole hearing. Of course, I cannot gloss over the fact that Tex Watson had the audacity to call Sharon Tate a pathetic blonde woman. Could he have portrayed himself any more as a heartless, cold-blooded killer? Even if someone does not want to believe that Susan stabbed Sharon, by Tex's own account, he said that Susan held Sharon down. That still makes her guilty, as she participated in the murder, preventing the victim to leave. After I watched the 1976 movie Helter Skelter, I feel like it was clear Susan hoped to make a movie out of her book. There are scenes in the book that seem to be dramatic, which would have made more sense on screen than on paper. Like, the one example that came to mind was the supposed dream she had, where she was covered in sheets and screaming for her father and brothers. I have often doubted whether that dream was even true, though of course we can't prove whether she truly dreamt that. But the various sequences in this book seemed like it was, oh my God, this would be perfect for a movie. Thankfully, no movie was ever created for this book. There are parts from my original review to the book that I still agree with to this day. In my 2021 review, I stated that there were various alarming examples of her behavior that just do not go talked about. I still found the scene where she talked about waking up naked and alone after taking LSD for the first time to be alarming. I still question whether she was raped or not, because the man she had spent the night with got naked with her while she was under the influence. And then she woke up not remembering much of anything else, and the man was gone. The fact that Susan didn't see this as alarming is concerning. Or is that just her version of the story? Was there more that happened that she's not telling us? In my 2021 review, I also stated that Susan would mention certain things in passing later in the book instead of bringing them up when they would happen chronologically. For example, she made it seem like she was really sweet and nice while on death row. But it wasn't until after converting to Christianity that she would admit to having been nasty and mean before her conversion. There are multiple instances of her telling slight truths later, and I suppose that's just one of her character traits, to have told on herself. She would tell on herself just all through her life, really. I still agree that much of the truth was scrubbed to make her look good, though I still think that Susan didn't realize how bad the book made her look. I still think she had some sort of borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. Of course, I'm not a therapist, maybe someday, but even still, you just can't tell me there wasn't something deeply psychologically wrong with Susan Atkins. I still agree in my 2021 review where I just believe that she was mentally disturbed. Rereading her book made me realize how much she tried to fit in and prove herself to others. In some ways, she was right, where she wasn't fully accepted by the other members of the Manson family, but it's not because they were just randomly mean to her. Susan was often overbearing and would get on people's nerves. In fact, that's kind of proven with how she became this fervent religious believer in prison. That same fervent, overbearing personality was something that was seen when she was with the Manson family. It was laughable to read the chapter where she acted like she was just like Charlie and could be in charge just like him. On one hand, she wanted to prove herself as tough so bad, even in this book, yet she couldn't take accountability for killing a pregnant woman. So which one is it, Susan? I mean, really? Could Susan take charge and be a boss like Charlie? Or was she just another drone taking orders from him? The hypocrisy isn't ever addressed in her book, of course. Once again, I also agree with my 2021 review, where I stated that Susan Atkins was incredibly selfish and only thought of herself. She didn't even care about her baby and didn't see him as a person even when she was pregnant. Possibly, especially, actually, probably even more so when she was pregnant. It was not lost on me how Charles Manson, of all people, had to tell Susan to tone down taking drugs while pregnant. How ironic is it that Charles Manson, who's made out to be this scary guy, this evil dude in Susan's own book, yet he's made out to be the worst person in the world when she also admits that he told her that she's taken too many drugs. He was the one that was actually trying to help her unborn baby. Susan Atkins continued to get high anyway, as she admits in her book, and doesn't even seem to connect the fact that she went into premature labor with her drug use. Those two things don't seem to connect for her. I wonder if Susan did hard drugs while pregnant also. She admitted to doing meth before going to Cielo Drive, and apparently, according to Tex Watson in one of his Christian films, they took meth before going to Cielo Drive, and then they drove around, and then they took some more meth. So twice they did drugs before committing the Tate murders. In her 1978 parole hearing, Susan stated that the methadone was mixed as a white powder with cocaine, which her and Tex snorted. I mean, would it be too crazy to ask whether she had done such hard drugs the year before she even gave birth to her son? In her book, she made it seem like she was only doing LSD and pot while pregnant. Of course, that's not good either. But I question, did she do more than that when pregnant? In the 2021 review I had for the book, I stated that I was surprised that her son survived at all. And I still feel that way. I still agree with that. The boy was born 2 months premature, and he was 2 pounds. She even said that he was translucent. In a place without running water and is often depicted as dirty, I am surprised that the baby made it. And I'm not trying to sound condescending. I'm seriously surprised. I still wish that Susan talked more about her time at the Fountain of the World, even through all of the literature I've read about the Manson family, the Fountain of the World is something that they just never really wrote about very much. I wish she would have talked about it more because we could have at least heard more about her baby. But maybe she just didn't care enough about her child to write about him. As in 2021, I was still shocked, though, at how Susan admitted that the doctors told her she needed a hysterectomy after all of the STDs she had. She was only 21, and needed a hysterectomy from STDs. I mean, I also wonder, too, does she have any when she was pregnant? That's a scary thought. Susan says she didn't want a hysterectomy and she denied the recommendation, but I still wonder, like in my original review, did she ever go through with it? Especially when she reached middle age. I also remember reading how her teeth were in terrible condition. They were in terrible shape after everything happened, which is also pretty shocking considering how much work was apparently done at Dennis Wilson's dime. So it's crazy to think she had her teeth worked on, maybe not completely fixed, but she had her teeth worked on at Dennis Wilson's expense, only to still have them rot out again thanks to drugs. I guess, though, that wouldn't be surprising considering she admitted to doing meth. In the years since I originally read the book, I always wondered what STP was. And I looked it up, of course, and apparently it was a less potent form of LSD, from what I understand. I've asked other people about it, and no one I've ever met had ever tried it, even the older people I asked. And I guess it's okay to mention his name. One time I went to an I Hate God show and I ended up talking to Mike Williams, the singer. And I had even asked him, Mike Williams from I Hate God, about it. And he even told me he had never heard of STP before. And I just thought, like, this is just a general idea I had, that it's strange in a way that Susan Atkins took a drug that not long after basically went extinct. That's just an interesting point of history. But back to her teeth, though. Looking at videos of her parole hearings, like decades after, I think she definitely must have gotten like dentures or something like that in middle age, because her teeth looked a lot better. There are pictures that, I've used in videos on this channel where you could see how pretty messed up and gross Susan's teeth were. There are a lot of photos from before she was in prison, and she looked very, very rough. I do wish, she could have maybe talked about that. That's why in her second quote-unquote book, I wish they talked more about her time in prison. Did she get the hysterectomy? Did she get dentures? Because she definitely looked different. In photos from like the 90s, Susan definitely looks better, if not healthier. She looks healthier than basically when she was free, strangely enough. But one line from my original review, which I think is still very, very on point, was when I had asked, how could a person, a real and compassionate human being, ever believe that they could be free after all of the destruction they had done? I don't think there's any better way to question this. How could Tex, Susan, Patricia, and the others seriously believe that they deserve to be free after all of the victims that were cheated out of their lives and humanity? The fact that Susan never even seemed to think something like this shows me her lack of compassion for her fellow humans. Her complete disregard of her pregnancy showed me that she didn't consider anyone to be a human except herself and maybe Charlie. Between Tex and Susan's books, I do believe that Susan's is still the better of the two, though not by a long shot. Susan inadvertently admitted to things that Tex has kept quiet about. Susan even pointed out that the murders were actually more about copycat killings to release Bobby Beausoleil instead of the race war idea that was pushed so strongly by Bugliosi. And ironically, this is something that George Stimson wrote about in his book, Goodbye, Helter Skelter. Stimson's book makes contentions against Bugliosi's race war theory. Tex Watson's book seems to focus on being brainwashed, though, on the helter-skelter idea entirely, which is an interesting difference between Susan's book and how she even admits that this was kind of more about copycat killings. Of course, though, any idea of a potential drug burn or talk about dealing drugs is scant to non-existent between both books, between Susan and Tex Watson. Despite drugs being found in Jay Sebring's car, despite Wojtek Frykowski and Abigail Folger's ties with drugs, and Tex Watson admitting himself to dealing drugs, even in his own book. The idea of drugs having anything to do with these crimes is ignored. Though, strangely, Susan admitted in the book that Tex Watson was dealing drugs too. Also, she said that the Manson family was great at crashing parties. Is it possible that some of the celebrities Charlie Manson knew, were they buying drugs from Tex Watson? Of course, this is a hard book to recommend to anyone. I wouldn't recommend this to some random guy off the street. If you don't know anything about Charles Manson, you'd be so confused about this. It's not something that many people can get into, whether they know about Charlie or not, honestly. If you're deep into the rabbit hole, I do think it's worth a read, at least once. One time. Try it once, right? But you don't have to read the entire book, honestly. If you're into the Tate LaBianca murders and reading about that, the chapters I mainly found interesting would be interesting for this would be probably chapter 12 and 13, that of course talk about the crimes. The chapters I found mainly interesting myself were, of course, the ones about Anton LaVey, the ones about the crimes, and the first couple of chapters on death row. I think those really, 100 pages are the only parts worth reading. So basically half the book is actually worth reading, truly. Once Susan starts getting religious, I just kind of felt embarrassed. I was getting secondhand embarrassment once I started reading about the conversion stuff. It just really jumped the shark, in my honest opinion. I don't regret reading this book, though, as bad as it could be, as painful it could get through, as it would be to get through at times. I like the book because, in a sense, it helps you understand the mentality of somebody that was a part of the Manson family, that was a part of these murders, and could never take accountability for it. You know what I mean? I like to see, from Susan's point of view, how she would explain her own personal dissent, which, of course, isn't the full story, which tells you a lot more than what she ever would herself. Right? You know what I mean? What she omits from the book says a lot more than what she actually allowed. Thankfully, many people saw through the book and much of Susan's antics while she was alive, and in prison, of course, where she stayed for the rest of her life. In fact, there were doubts about Susan's conversion and the book when it was released in 1977. I have some clippings. I'm sure I'll probably include them throughout this whole video. But there were people, including Stephen Kay, that were just saying, of course, she would jump from one cult to another. She jumps from a religious nut. She jumps from a cult to becoming a religious zealot. It wasn't really surprising. And there are people who are like that. I still have my own personal thoughts about calling the Manson family a cult, as much as I feel it's just more about crazy organized crime, but that's something for another video. So once again, thank you so much if you watched this whole video. If you listen to me read the book, I want to thank you also, and especially the parts where I just had to go off camera and just straight up record in front of the mic. Once again, halfway through the book, I just started feeling really bad with the arthritis. I guess my body couldn't take it anymore. My body's like, stop reading this shit. If you enjoyed this video, consider liking it. If you aren't subscribed but you watched this whole video, please consider subscribing. Share it. Tell your friends about it. I would really appreciate it. Every like helps throw the channel more into the algorithm, and I would like to grow the channel a lot more. We've been kind of hanging around 5,400 and some change subscribers. I do want to grow from here. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.